Dwarves. They like beards, brew, and battle axes. But these traits seem to follow them around in just about every fantasy setting. They're getting a bit stagnant. I know they're a race that values tradition, but let's shake them up a bit. Let's break some of those tropes. But we need to still make sure they're recognizable as dwarves. So, how do we go about doing this? First, let's take a look at the dwarfs' beards and their general appearance. First, they don't need the beards. "Not the beard!" screams Gimli. Too bad. Cut that off. They don't actually need their beards in the dark sun setting. The dwarves are completely hairless, and that doesn't stop you from recognizing them as the short, squat, hard-working folk that are the dwarves. I've noticed in some of the more recent settings, like Dragon Age and the Iron Kingdoms, the dwarves there have the same facial hair propensities as humans. Some of them have beards, some of them don't, and most of the soldiers and the warriors, they are in fact clean-shaven, which does make sense. The next dwarf character that I play will not have a beard, but rather will have glorious Martin Van Buren mutton chops that will awe all who gaze upon him. -2 charisma my ass. Now, dwarves do need to remain smaller than humans. After all, it's right there in the name, right? Well, there's another thing. The dwarves, that's what the humans call them. The dwarves are going to have their own name, like the Kazakh, as they are in both Warhammer Fantasy and Middle-earth. In the Iron Kingdoms, they're called the Rulik peoples, because they come from the nation of Rule. Dwarf is not where they're going to be calling themselves when they're hanging around in the taverns. Now, I'm okay with a larger dwarf, as it were. I'm okay with like a 5-foot dwarf. You know, it might come up to about here on me. A 4-foot tall dwarf, well, here, dwarves do not have a strength penalty. A 4-foot tall dwarf probably does. So when a dwarf is smaller than a human, but not too small as to gain a penalty, that's fine with me. A 5-foot dwarf that's 4 feet wide and just jacked. That's how a dwarf, I feel, should look. They should look like Glenn Danzig. They should be very short, but hugely muscled and angry all the time. Now, other dwarven appearance. The dwarves typically look Nordic in their face, because that is, after all, where the legends come from, right? But do the dwarves in your campaign, do they only come from Europe? What about, let's say, some Middle Eastern dwarves? Ones that look like the ancient Babylonians with those ringlet beards, and the women have their hair done up in very intricate hairdos. You know, you can shake up the dwarven appearance a bit by having them from different regions of the world. Perhaps your dwarves are quite literally the children of stone, and they're completely hairless, and their skin is gray and tan and perhaps mottled with other colors, and they're very drab, and yet they look like stone, and yet their eyes are these bright and beautiful blues and greens and purples, much like gems set into a rock. And their clothing will be drab, earth-tone tunics. And they take no pride in their clothing, but their jewelry is the envy of the world. They have the most intricate jewelry with the most amazing gem work set into it. And this is their most valued trade export, and is the envy of the world to get some dwarven jewelry. Oh. Now we can look to the dwarves of many other cultures throughout the world. The Hawaiians actually have some dwarves called the Minahuni, and they are, short, secretive, industrious people. So when your player characters are sailing around and they think they know all there is to know about dwarves, perhaps they meet some island dwarves, and then they have a luau and everything's awesome, and they are surprised that, oh, look at this new and interesting dwarven culture that we had no idea existed. Now let's talk about the brew and dwarven culture in general. Where are the dwarves getting all these hops and barley in the mountains for their drink? Now, dwarves probably are making some sort of freaky-ass fungus brew, and by all accounts it's probably insanely nasty, and no one except dwarves will like to chug this stuff. Or perhaps dwarves are not famed for their alcohol at all. Maybe because they're in the mountains, they have the purest and the best water from the snowmelt. And oh, dwarven water, that's a great trade export. That's what we want to buy. And that's what they're famed for. Now, looking further at dwarven cultures, since dwarves often look Nordic in the artwork, how about basing them more off of the Viking culture? Now suddenly these dwarves are scary. These dwarves come from the land of the ice and snow, with the midnight sun and the hot springs flow. But instead of sailing their ships to new lands, they burrow under the earth, and they make lightning raids against human settlements, and they jack all that gold, and they disappear back into the earth. Suddenly, when you see a dwarf, it's not, oh good, here comes that dwarf. Perhaps he will settle near me and I may pet him. No, instead it's, oh, look out, here comes that dwarf. Other cultures that work well with dwarves is the samurai culture. Think about the honor, the discipline, the self-sacrifice, and the absolute loyalty that the samurai value so highly. These are all traditionally dwarven traits. So, you know, the dwarves may be writing their haiku using as few runes as possible to express the most they can in these short poems. Perhaps the dwarves value the gentle folding and the intricate works of origami just as much as they value prowess on the battlefield. Of course, a dwarf samurai who needs to commit seppuku is going to have a hard time doing it with a hammer, but that's the price of loyalty. In my own campaign, I used both northern and eastern dwarves. And what I did with the northern dwarves, they're the ones who looked Nordic. And yet their society was a completely mercantile one. They did not have any kings, and they did not have any hereditary titles. It was all run by corporations called guilds, and they were led by CEOs that they called thanes. In this society, it was money that was literally power. They made all the laws in their own lands. Now, in this setting, a miserable dwarf, a poor dwarf is a miserable dwarf. And these are the ones who went off to become adventurers so they could bring back a bunch of gold and gain power. Because in this society, gold, literally, is power. Now, in this nightmare dystopia, there was actually a silver lining in dwarven culture because they had upward mobility. In the rest of the world, it was feudal. If you're born a serf, you die a serf. If you're born a noble, you will live as a noble. But in dwarven society, a dwarf who begins his life as a shoeshine boy with enough cunning and enough, perhaps, brutality, earning enough gold, he may become a thane, someone of immense power. So that was, instead of the American dream, it was the Dwarfican dream in that culture. I also used Eastern dwarves, and they were based off of the Chinese culture. Now, in our world, humans built the Great Wall of China to protect themselves against the Mongol invaders, and that was all well and good. But these dwarves built the greatest wall because they had to defend themselves against orcs who were riding around on saber-toothed tigers. So you know they're going to have the most impressive wall ever. Now, let's talk about battle axes and dwarven weaponry in general. Now, are dwarves chopping a lot of wood when they're in those underground tunnels? Probably not. Now, we know dwarves are stubby and they're slow. So what weapons will they like? I think dwarves would love to fight in a good old-fashioned Greek phalanx or a Roman legion style of warfare. They will have their tower shields, and they will have their spears, and they will defend those tunnels the same way that 300 Spartans will against the unending hordes of orcs and goblins. Of course, they are still in the tunnels, so when things need to get up close and personal, this is when the dwarf draws his secondary weapon, his gladius, his short sword. It is short, it is thick, and it is deadly, just like a dwarf. Now, dwarves are also a practical people. So maybe they will eschew any weapon that is not also a tool. This means that the dwarves will be running around using their hammers and their war picks and spades, an entrenching tool, and that will open up an orc's melon just as easily as any axe. Or think about this. Dwarves value stone. Perhaps they will even worship stone. And so perhaps there are dwarven monasteries out there where they meditate upon the unyielding and eternal nature of stone. Now you have dwarven monks, and they will hone their bodies and focus their chi so that they can punch through brick or shatter a goblin's stupid face with one blow. Oh, and in a lot of settings, it is typically the dwarves who are at the forefront of technology. So if there is gunpowder in your setting, then it is probably a dwarf who is either they're the sole proprietors of it, or they're the first to invent gunpowder. This can make dwarves a bit different and a bit frightening. If they're the first ones in the campaign world to have this stick that shoots out smoke and a single projectile, and it can kill any knight in full plate with a thunderous crash. Suddenly, these dwarves have upset the traditionally, feudal knight in full plate riding around on his horse. Suddenly, these dwarves have brought something into the world that has greatly upset the balance. What do the other races think of this? Do they want to crush the dwarves and destroy this technology? Or do they suddenly bow down to the dwarves, clamoring for, oh, give us some guns as well, so that we may smite our foes? But if you don't like gunpowder in your fantasy, I do, but if you don't, then the dwarves will probably be the first to invent things like the repeating crossbow, or the trebuchet, or the mangonel, or they will be able to fling Greek fire, or alchemist fire, or dwarven fire, as it is called in D&D. These are all ways to shake up the dwarves, to shape them, to mold them, and to make them just a bit different. So, in your campaigns, how have you utilized our furry little friends, the dwarves?